Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey up, weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and hopefully my guest today may be witness to biblical prophecy come true, and there shall be destruction and darkness come upon creation, and the beast shall reign over the earth. Welcome, Eric McNaughton. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm a bit scared now after that introduction.
Don't be
look out
scared.
my window and see some giant creatures.
I was going to say don't be scared. I don't bite, but I can't guarantee that's the case. How you doing? How you doing? How you been? Are you busy?
Very, very busy. As you know, I work as a tour guide, and this is just non-stop at the moment. So, but it's good. It's all monies. So, and then I've got like 4 more tours, and then I have 4 months off to catch up with all the movies I've bought and all the books I haven't read, and the usual things. So, but yeah, life is good.
Yeah, it's a never-ending nightmare, quite literally.
Yes.
In terms of getting over. Yeah, I'm the same. Just constantly reading sort of film and film related books and other stuff as well, and ghost stories and stuff like that as well. But yeah, the films, it's never ending, isn't it, with the films?
Yeah, people just keep releasing box sets constantly.
Yeah.
It's so annoying.
Well, I mean, I'm a big advocate of 21st century. I think there's a lot of really good 21st century films, horror films especially. But you could spend the next 20 years just investigating 20th century. And you'd never run out of films, would you?
Oh, absolutely.
It's vast.
Yeah, I know.
So Eric, I know you as a lot of other people will know you from fantastic long-running horror magazine We Belong Dead. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, well, actually, we celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. So it was launched as a fanzine back in the 90s. I was living in Nottingham at the time, and there was very little in the way of classic horror, which is what I kind of grew up with as a teenager. And there was Fangoria and Gorzone and all this kind of stuff, but very little classic stuff. Whereas in the 70s, you were inundated with classic horror books and magazines. So I thought, I'll do my own fanzine. And that's how it started. I mean, I look back on those original issues now, and they're very amateurish. It literally was pair of scissors, some glue, typewriter kind of thing. And it amazes me sometimes people send me links to eBay where you can get issue number 2 for like $300. It's insane, I have one copy of everything, but they're simply not worth that, to be honest. They're very, very amateurish. And so I did. It got better. At the time I was working as a printer, so I could use the facilities as a place I worked. And then we went up to issue number 8, and then we stopped mainly because I went gallivanting off down to South America, traveling there, and then I moved to Dublin, and I moved to Paris for 10 years. But the interest was always there, and the love was always there. And then relaunched again with issue number 8 or number 9 in, it must have been 5 or 6 years ago now. And what I'd done, when I was in Paris, I'd started a Facebook group, We Belong Dead, and I realized there was a huge amount of interest still in classic horror. So I thought, why not give it a go? And I thought I'll do a one-off relaunch issue. And here we are, going strong. I've just sent today issue 37 to my designer. He's going to work on that. And then from there, we just branched out and we started doing books. And the first one was the 70s Monster Memories, which sold out pretty much instantly. And I'd never done a book before. And I mean, it's a risk because it's a huge financial outlay. You're talking like £20,000, but we covered our costs. And then since then we've done, oh my goodness, I think about 12 books. I'm just working on the 13th book, which is a Euro horror, and they always seem to sell very well. We do limited runs, and they pretty much sell out within a couple of months. So yeah, so that's where we are. And last year, just because really, I had 2 years of inactivity work-wise with COVID, and I was suddenly back at work doing my tours, and I just the magazine was bi-monthly, but I just realised during the lockdowns that was fine. I didn't have anything else to do, so I could concentrate on that. But then with all my work coming back, I simply didn't have the time to put into the magazine that it deserved. So my very good friend Daryl Buxton, who I've known for nearly 30 years, he stepped in. So he's now the editor. He's just celebrated his first anniversary. So he's been doing it for a year now, and he's doing a fantastic job. And I can't, I'm still there in the background, and my role really, I asked Daryl if I can do the picture research because I love doing that for the books and the magazine. So, but yeah, we're going from strength to strength. We've got Daryl's a lot more organised than me, so he's got issues planned up into next year. So it's good. It's in safe hands. So yeah,
it's really lovely. I mean, I write for a number of magazines, different sort of horror related magazines, and I enjoy all of that. It's great. But there's something very, I know that this word gets overused, this idea of community. I'm a bit sort of reluctant to use that word because, like I say, I think it's overused. But I think with something like We Belong Dead, it genuinely feels like that. It feels like everybody that's involved is there not for any other reason other than the fact there is a solid love for these films and a particular era.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it feels more like a family, and some of my closest friends I met through the magazine, and and we've been friends for years, and I love that about it. And it's when I was editing the magazine, to be honest, my criteria was what would 15, 16-year-old me want to read about in a magazine. So I just picked articles that I would like to read, and then I put it out to the writers, and we have a fabulous collection of writers, yourself included, and artists as well, some excellent artists, and I like the informal way it is as well, because people can just pick a movie which everyone else might think is just awful film, but they love it so passionately that they sing its praises, and it's great. Lots of different writing styles, but it kind of all comes together. And yeah, I mean, the shared thing, as you say, is that love for classic horror. Originally, we had a very strict cut-off date of 1979, but then a few years ago, I was sat there one day, and I realised I was looking nostalgically back at the 1980s, which to me was still just a couple of years ago. But it's so we've relented on that. So we cover a lot of 80s and 90s stuff, and occasionally we'll even do more modern stuff as well if it fits in with what we're doing with the magazine.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think it was Kim Newman. I think he said it in an introduction to one of the We Belong Dead books, and he said, every year now we're going to be in. There's going to be 100-year-old horror film sort of every year from now, because
exactly.
and I know that when if I write for I do a lot of work for Scream magazine, and most of the work I do for Scream magazine is anniversary stuff, and most of it's the 80s.
It's crazy, isn't it?
You feel like he's really dated. Like, can you do something on American Werewolf in London, because that's 40 years old. What eh?
It's scary, isn't it, actually? Yeah.
So Eric, what was your entry point into horror then?
So it was actually three things that came almost simultaneously, and it was back in 1974. so I was only 13 years old then. And the first thing I remember very, very clearly is we were on a family holiday on the Isle of Wight. We used to go there every year, come down from Durham. And I had a post office savings account, which had a grand total of, I think, £2.50, which was a fortune in those days, for a kid. And we were on holiday in Ryde on the Isle of Wight. And we walked down one of the main streets, and there was a bookshop, and in the window was this amazing, it was the cover, which I always remember, this lurid green cover, and there's Frankenstein's monster staring out. Of course, it was the Dennis Gifford pictorial history of horror movies, which I think for a lot of us was our way into the genre.
Bible.
Yeah, and it's just absolutely, it was just the cover that caught me, and of course it was a pictorial history. And I think it was £1.99. So I spent most of my holiday money getting that, and then never looked back really. And then Alan Frank's books I picked up, but the Gifford book particularly. I mean, it comes in for a lot of criticism because of his dismissal of kind of Hammer and some more modern films. But I think at the time he was writing, that was he. To us, yeah, the Universals are so far away, but to him, that's the films he grew up with, and I think it's the films you grew up with that you have a special affection for. And while he might have been dismissive of Hammer, that book was absolutely packed full of images from Hammer films. It's the first time I saw any images of Christopher Lee as Dracula, for example. And I mean, you talk to people of a certain age about that book, and there's a still of the woman with the axe in her head from the Black Cat, which I only got to see. It's this weird independent American film from the 60s, and I only got to see that a few years ago. And of course, at the time, at the back he had an index of films, and you would tick off the films you saw on TV. But at the time, you think, well, I'm never going to see these, really obscure Japanese films and silent movies. And now we have them all on Blu-ray and box sets, and it's incredible. I suspect some of the films he never actually saw, to be honest, when you read his writing. But it was the visuals that was the thing. And even now, when I watch movies, I have these Gifford moments, and often the images are better than the films. And as a child, you never thought you'd see these films, so you build up what the film was going to be like, and of course, in reality, it was never anything like that. So that was definitely the first my entry point. But round about the same time, I remember going with my mum to our local newsagents. And do you remember those? They used to have those like kind of metal racks that you turn around, and they had all the comics in there.
Yep.
And I used to get the DC ones, like The Unexpected and House of Mystery and that kind of thing. And we went in there, and there it didn't even really fit. It was folded over. There was Monster Mag #1. For sale to adults only, 15 pence. And I don't know, I somehow persuaded my mum to buy that for me. And again, it was the images, and it was incredible. I look back at it now, and to think that Des Skinner, who ended up doing Monster Mag and House of Hammer, these days, when I'm not working, we meet up every Tuesday for a coffee, and I still pinch myself thinking, this is the guy who did House of Hammer magazine and Monster Mag, and so my bedroom was all these Monster Mag posters. And then the third thing was one day I was as a teenager, I was really into model kits, usually like fighter planes or the Bismarck and stuff like that. And I went to my local model shop, and there in the window again, it was the image that caught me was one of the Aurora square boxes, the glow-in-the-dark models, Phantom of the Opera, 99 pence. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have that. And I collected pretty much all of those glow-in-the-dark models, with the exception of King Kong and Godzilla. For some reason, I could never find. But yeah, so those three things coming a few months of each other started our own love of horror movies. And I mean, I'm sure it's the same with you and many other people. You look back and think, oh, God, I wish I'd kept all those things. Because as an adult, Phantom of the Opera model is probably going to set you back like £1 or something these days, But yeah, those are the three things. And from there, in the 70s was a great time to be into monsters because it seemed like every week a new monster magazine came out. So we were very, very spoilt for choice then. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I stated on this podcast again and again. I mean, that the importance of those, the Gifford and the Alan Frank books, and like you say, it was the images. It's difficult to get that over in this internet age. That now you can access pretty much any image you
Yeah.
want to, in terms of films, which is great, but then, because you might never at that point, like you said, you might think, well, I'm never going to see this film, particularly
Hmm.
if it's some sort of more obscure film. So those images, they would conjure things in your head. And you created, because there was this disconnect with actually being able to access these films. In a weird way, they created more of a kind of an emotional link, because you became
Definitely.
obsessed with them. As I've said over and over again, that in the Alan Frank book, it was that image from Freaks that just
Yes.
fascinated me, because it didn't make any sense. It was just like,
Yeah.
you see Johnny Eck, just leaning with one hand. You think, how is that even happening? What am I looking at? And I
I know.
remember also, I think it was again in the Alan Frank, the pictorial history of horror, the images, which I think were cut from the theatrical version, but they're in the Alan Frank book, of the mummy, the Christopher Lee 1959, the mummy, of the tongue
Mhm.
being taken out, because
Yes. Yeah.
you got to see those pictures of the people cutting his tongue out, holding the tongue up, and it's just, that was just like, wow. And one, I was slightly, when I actually got to see the mummy, I was slightly disappointed because those images
It
weren't
was.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, but oh yeah,
Yeah.
just incredible books, great books. So I think we'll introduce the film. So today we are going to be looking at the 1954 monster movie Them, as directed by Gordon Douglas.
Get the antennae! Get the antennae! Get the other antenna! Get the other antenna! He's helpless without them!
So Eric, when was the first time you came across this film?
So I remember it so well. So I lived in County Durham. So our local TV channel was Tyne Tees, and on a Friday they would have, like, it was kind of like an appointment with fear thing. 10:30 after the news, they would have a horror film on, and I was already into horror movies by that point. I think I'd already seen Dracula, Prince of Darkness was my first entry into Hammer. I remember that vividly. That was actually on BBC. And I remember in school, I remember it so well. I was there in what was then called technical drawing. I don't know if you even still do that at school. I found it incredibly boring, but and people were talking about, oh, what's the horror movie tonight? Because in those days, everybody wanted to watch these films, and everybody would talk about them in the playground. And we talked about the Gifford book. I remember bringing my copy in, and it got passed around the entire classroom. Everyone, like, wow, look at this. And
No,
in
no,
the
nobody wanted to be that kid at that point
yes,
that hadn't seen the horror film that was on the night
exactly.
before.
So people would say they'd seen it, even if it was obvious that they hadn't. But in the listings in the local newspaper, the Northern Echo, it just said Friday night, Friday fright film, them with an exclamation mark, 1954, and that's all it said. And I thought, well, what on earth is this going to be about? Like, and I remember that day I went in my head. I created all these different stories I had, because it said, that's all it said. It said nothing, and I knew nothing about this film at all. And so, as 10:30 approached, I'm like, what's it going to be? And then, that very effective title card came on, and I didn't know what I was watching at first, because as you know, the first half of it, it's almost like a detective procedural thing.
Yeah.
Um, so until that first ant appeared, I had no idea it was about ants or giant ants or radiation or anything. And that was such a shock, and that weird noise that you keep hearing, and that always stayed with me. I mean, I've seen it many, many times since, but it's never fails to entertain. It's one of those movies that I just watch endlessly over and over again and be entertained by it.
It's got it's got multiple elements. I think, like you said, the first. I mean, when I was watching it again the other day, what struck me, the first half an hour of it, like you said, it is this kind of police procedural. But I think
Mm,
also as well, the first half hour, it's pure horror. And
yes.
and part I love, don't get me wrong, I love it when the giant ants appear and it turns into a monster movie. But actually, that first half an hour, that it could have been a kind of almost a Val Lewton sort of film, that you could have not had the ants in it at all and it would have been really effective. Because I love the clues they set and the suspense they build, obviously with the scene with the little girl and the formic acid,
Hmm.
and the caravans being ripped apart and the sugar lumps and all this kind of stuff. It really, really builds the tension. And it's almost, I think, that first half an hour as well is almost like you've got this detective elements, you've got this slow build of the horror, but it's also kind of ghostly and haunting as well. The desert and the sand being swept up against. It's really, it is like a ghost story. It's really,
Oh,
that
very,
first half hour is brilliantly atmospheric.
very much so. And then even when the scientists arrive and they kind of know what it is, but they still keep the audience in the dark.
Yeah, yeah.
Until that first revealed. And I mean, anyone who knows anything about the film knows that originally Warner Brothers were going to do it in color and 3D.
Mm.
But I'm kind of glad that it's black and white because it gives it that kind of almost documentary film noir feel to it.
Yeah, it
You
does.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, I don't think it worked in color. I mean, not only because I don't know what they would have done with the ants, because apparently, um, the ants were like a purple green color in
that's what I
reality,
heard. Yes,
and
yeah.
I always when I found out that, I always kind of imagined some poor souls driving through the desert coming across these big massive purple green ants who must have wondered whether they'd had a bit of peyote in their coffee. um
Yeah,
yeah, no, I think it works much better as a black and white film. Like you said, it's very noirish in places and ghost story like and detective procedure. It's got all these this stuff going on. I love the whole film, but I love that first half an hour. I think it's really effective.
yeah. And then, as you say, it's suddenly, wow, it's a monster movie. And going into it not knowing anything about it was wonderful. But I think, yeah, even today we've got CGI and everything that you can accomplish on the screen. I still think it's incredibly effective. I mean, I'm not sure now you look at it, ants actually look anything like that. But to me, that's always going to be the giant ant film or the giant monster film. I mean, and of course, many, many came afterwards. You had
Mm.
Universal did Tarantula, which is also excellent
Yeah, it's
film.
brilliant. Yeah.
But it kind of opened the floodgates because it was so successful for Warner Brothers. I mean, I think it was that unexpected hit of 1954. And over the years, I've read a lot of things about. I think that even at the moment, somebody's mooting a remake of it, and I'm not one of these people who say, "Oh, you should never remake these films," because the original film's always going to be there. So I never really understood the argument, the hatred that people have for remakes, and but for me, that was the film that really got me into the science fiction rather than horror because it's kind of like I said, it's a mixture of science fiction and horror, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, obviously you've got the, the whole kind of the science element of it, but also there are scenes, as I said, the first half an hour is pure horror, but also, you know, maybe younger audiences might look at the effects now and laugh a little bit. I don't know, but I think there were moments of genuine horror. When they're flying over and they see the ant, with
Oh, in the nest,
yeah,
yes,
with a carcass in, yeah, just
yes,
really
yeah.
really effective. It's brilliantly done, that is, and it's terrifying. It's really really
It's
good.
great. And of course, the sound before you ever see them, that
Yeah.
sound that they make is that stays with you. And I mean, it's one of those films. There's so many memorable scenes, but particularly, when the first ant appears and they have to shoot the antennae, and then when you see when they go into the nest as well, it's terrifying. You
Yeah, it's
know,
very
um,
eerie. The nest, especially, I think, with the eggs and stuff. And again, that was one of those images from the I think it was the Dennis Gifford book. Yeah, and it just looks very uncanny, and very 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 mysterious. Um, but like you say, it was kind of part. It was one of, well, it's probably the first kind of big bug movie, but it was also part and parcel of those films that came out in the early to mid 50s, where we saw, um, so before in the 30s we'd had the kind of gothic horror stuff, and then
mm,
they'd sort of revived that in the 40s with the, after the really successful, when they'd re-released Dracula and Frankenstein in 1938. So there was this urge to come back, so Universal made this string of 40s monster movies in, but
yes,
then that slowly having those original monsters almost be killed off by the likes of Abbott and Costello, and people getting
yes, yeah.
older, and Karloff and Lugosi going on getting older. And then we had these atomic age films, really. So we saw this change from pure horror to more science fiction. So, I mean, what's your take on that kind of changeover and those sort of science fiction films that came about in the 50s?
Well, I think certainly, with the development of the atomic bombs and everything, the world, and I think also after the real life horrors of the Second World War, there was no appetite for gothic horror. It's seen its day, and it was kind of the law of diminishing returns, wasn't it? And I mean, one of the things I like about them is also I think it has a message in there about we've opened this door, and who knows what's going to happen now. We've exploded this bomb. And I think the gothic horrors had become more just cliches of themselves. They were more for the kids. They weren't really taken that seriously. Of course, until the late 50s when Hammer came along and infused it with blood and color. Um, but suddenly it was all about science fiction, but particularly giant monsters. I think and I think one of the big influences for Hollywood, of course, was Godzilla in Japan,
Yeah.
which is, when you talk to people about Godzilla, a lot of people don't take them seriously because the later ones are just kiddies films. But you watch that original one; it's a very sobering, very depressing film. And these people had lived through two of their cities being having atom bombs dropped on them, and Godzilla is all about that, isn't it? It's about the effect of radiation, and it's a very, very serious picture. It's a fantastic
Godzilla's
movie,
grim. Godzilla
isn't it?
has
Yeah.
more akin with something like Threads in parts. It's very
Well,
documentary
definitely.
like. It's not.
I mean, they develop, he develops that bomb that takes all the oxygen out of the
Yeah.
ocean, and he kills himself because, and you can see the comparisons. It's very relevant today. With Oppenheimer out at the cinemas and stuff. So I think Godzilla certainly had a big effect. Of course, the US got the rights and they released a different version with Raymond Burr, which if anyone still hasn't seen the original, watch the Japanese one definitely because it's very, very different in tone. But I mean, I think the studios, including Warner Brothers, thought, "Oh, it's making a fortune. Let's do something with giant monsters. And so that was kind of the floodgates, because then Universal, who was the home of the gothic classic monsters, they make Tarantula, and then they start making a whole series of movies, and most of them are unfortunately quite inferior, but still a lot of fun, you know. And I think, I mean, it's hard for us now in this day and age to think how people viewed these things back in the 50s. The war had ended with the dropping of the atomic bombs, but then you had the Cold War, and there was that very real fear that atomic war was going to break out and everyone was going to be killed. And nobody really knew what the effects of radiation were going to be. So I think that's why those films were so popular. Whereas the Gothic films, people thought, well, these aren't real. I mean, they're obviously not real, vampires and werewolves and stuff. But who knew with atomic testing what the effects were going to be, And I think that's why they became very, very popular, and they were a lot of fun as well. The movies.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sort of king of those kind of films at that time was like Jack Arnold. You've got all these brilliant sort of, even from something like Incredible Shrinking Man, or It Came from Outer Space, or whatever. It's, but I think that there were quite a number of those films, but obviously they were coming at it from different angles. So I think when a lot of those early 50s films, so Day the Earth Stood Still or whatever, there is this kind of almost this kind of Doctor Who Quatermass sort of element
Yeah,
of the scientist being in charge, the scientist being the hero, or the scientist, or logical thinking. But then there is a kind of this dichotomy where in a lot of the other films, particularly, if you think about Howard Hawks' production, Thing from Another World, it's almost it's the opposite. It's this gung ho. The scientists are not to be trusted, and
exactly.
it's the
Yes,
military. So, but I think them is a really good example of the military and scientists working together to try and
working
solve a
together.
problem.
And I think, I mean, my favorite character in that is one played by Edmund Gwenn,
Yes.
um, because he has that authority, and he has the most quotable lines, I think, in the whole movie. And there's just something about him. I don't know if it's because I associated him with Chris Kringle,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
and so he's already he's a trusting person and that, but and he's a wonderful actor as well. But I love the dynamics with him and his daughter, played by Joan Weldon, and but like you say, how they actually work with the military, um, rather than in the Thing from Another World working against each other.
Mm.
Yeah, and I love the Thing from Another World as well. It's typical kind of Howard Hawks, the overlaying dialogue. So which is what it'd be like in real life. That's how people talk.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah.
So and I love the monster in that as well. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I like them, perhaps because it's the first one I saw. It's the one that had the greatest impression on me, really. And I mean, I think that all of the cast are wonderful in that. I don't think there's a bad performance at all in that entire film. And it's funny the way that these films have an effect on you, because I remember when I was when I'd left school and I was unemployed. I used to go to the cinema all the time. It was so cheap, and those are the days you could just sit in the cinema and watch the same film over and over again. And there was a lot of reissues like Jaws and stuff like that. But I remember, I don't even know if I should admit this, but being a huge fan when Grease came out.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I was in love with Olivia Newton-John, and imagine my delight watching Grease, and right at the end where they have the car race, all I
Yes.
could
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
about was where are the ants,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's in that dried up Los Angeles River. It's so funny.
But also Greece. It's got clips from the Blob as well, hasn't it?
Yes,
When they
yeah,
were driving. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
yeah. So, these things just seep into your consciousness, don't they? And again, it's a film that I can just watch over and over, like Bride of Frankenstein and Jaws and Alien, and I never tire, and I see something new in it every time,
Mm.
and but yeah, it's just So I think it was a very real fear for people in the mid 50s, the threat of atomic war, and also the unknown. What does radiation do? What, can it make things grow larger? Um, and hence, there's so many films about things getting bigger and
No,
giant creatures and
the disappointing actual answer is no, it just melts you from the inside.
yeah,
It's not as good as giant
yeah,
ants. I want to live in a
exactly.
world where radioactivity produces giant ants.
And of course, I mean, I read somewhere once that when it was written, uh, what was the man's name? George. I can't remember offhand, but the guy who wrote it,
George Worthing
that's
Yates, yeah.
that's right, yes. But that summer, there'd been a huge infestation of ants all over the US. It had been a real problem. That gave him the idea. And his original script apparently had the ants in the New York subway, which I think if they do a remake, that would be a good
Yeah,
idea to go.
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to get back to casting and characters because I think there's a couple of things I want to talk about because the thing with them, I think there's a number of things with the casting and characting which is slightly unusual. Because it feels like there's not really a specific protagonist. It's very much an ensemble piece. And
It really is.
yeah, we'll get back to James Whitmore in a minute because there's a few issues I want to discuss about James Whitmore. But it feels well, clearly, someone like Joe Dante must have been very influenced by this film. Obviously, in terms of him referencing it in Matinee and things like that, but also, Joe Dante is the kind of master of the ensemble piece. It's very difficult to pick out a protagonist from a Joe Dante film. They tend to be ensemble casts, and I think this is very much ahead of its time in some ways. And I think that Joan Weldon as Pat, I think in some ways, obviously, it's of its time. She's progressive in that she is a scientist and she's at the forefront of the action and she goes down into the tunnels and she's all that. But obviously, we've got her out there. She is the kind of classic love interest, and also the first time we see her, of course, she gets her skirt caught on the
Yeah.
on the ladder, giving all the male stars in the cast an eyeful of her legs. So we've got all that kind of 50s nonsense going on. But I think in some ways it's very progressive in terms of casting and the way
Oh,
it's.
absolutely. I mean, I think it's unusual for a 50s science fiction film because it's a very strong female character. Um, Given everything that you've said, she's not just to stand there and scream and be terrorized and be rescued. She's part of the team. She takes an active part in it. And I think what's unusual about the cast is it's like you say, it's very ensemble cast. There's no star names really. I mean, I guess Edmund Gwenn would be the most
Mm.
to the 50s audience. He would be the most well-known actor in it. But I think that works to the benefit of the movie. And it reminds me a little bit of, when they were casting Jaws and they wanted all these big names um, in the parts, and then they went for relatively unknown people. And I think that works better because I don't know if it was Spielberg or Zanuck and Brown had said, if we cast big names, the audience would just be watching them all the time, and that's Steve McQueen, and it would take them out of the story. And I think it's the same. It's the same with them. I think. Um, and what also I think is unusual about them is you have these four main leads who become. They're not like superheroes; they're just ordinary people put in this extraordinary situation. But I think what's unusual about the movie, you get to know the characters, you get to like the characters, and then one of them is killed at the end.
Yeah.
Which normally there's a happy ending, everyone survives, the threat is done. And I think if as I said before, of the four characters, I think the elderly professor is my favorite. I mean, he just brings this kind of dignity to the role, and he gets all the best lines as well, of course. But they're all fantastic. And then even the supporting cast, the little girl, I think, is amazing.
Mm.
And when I started to watch the film the first time, I thought, what is going on? What's happened to this girl? And like, why is she like this? And
Well, I mean, we were talking about possible remakes or whatever. My
hmm.
my pitch, if I was gonna, not that I'm ever gonna be, presenting a Hollywood pitch, but if I was, my pitch would be, okay, let's set this in the mid 80s, 30 years on from the original events, and it's the story of the girl who's now in her sort of 30s or 40s or whatever, and she's trying to deal with this. And I just, there's a story in there, and obviously a resurgence of the ants or whatever, and she knows how to deal with it. But that would be my pitch. But she is great. She a little great. The haunting look on her face is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it's but like with a lot of these movies, at the end, I felt I didn't want the ants to be destroyed. I wanted to be another colony somewhere. You don't want the monsters to be killed. And the scene on the ship, I think, is very effective.
Yes.
Yeah, very well done. And I mean, of course, the giant life-size puppets, but I think they work actually remarkably well in scenes.
This. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I think we'll get back to James Whitmore in a minute. But there's a lot of stuff in there in terms of the story. Obviously, they wouldn't have had the budget or the technical know-how to do some of the stuff they're describing. But I like the fact that some of it happens off screen. The idea of the giant ants, crossing the ocean or attacking these ships, it's a terrifying idea. And I'm glad they didn't. We get a glimpse of one of the ants on the ship. That's about it. But I'm glad they didn't try and tackle it, because I like the idea of. We get all these kind of reliable or unreliable witnesses, and they're talking, and also we get the archetype, which became a kind of cinema archetype of the guy who lives out in the middle of nowhere, has seen some sort of UFO, and is immediately chucked into a lunatic asylum. No one's willing to discuss anything. No, he's clearly insane, Even though they're tackling giant ants, but he must be insane. And then you've got the drunks as well, which is quite. I like how there's all these kind of unreliable or reliable sort of witnesses as well.
Yes, definitely. I mean, those supporting characters, they make the film as well. Very entertaining, I think. And of course, James Arness. Was
Gunsmoke.
Gunsmoke, but the thing from another world as well.
Yeah.
I heard a story. I mean, you take all these things with a pinch of salt, but because he was so tall, they had to do a ditch for him to walk in, so he wasn't towering above the other cast members.
James Whitmore apparently used lifts in his shoes as well.
Right.
I think he needed stilts, to be honest. Well, James Whitmore is an odd character. I'm not taking anything away from him. A very fine actor, and he had an unbelievable career. He very prolific. He worked a lot in the sort of 40s, 50s. And obviously, went on to be sort of Brooks in the Shawshank Redemption and stuff like that. But I think he was, to be fair, I think he was a brilliant character actor. He's not leading man material at all, is he? Not by ours or the standards back then, which is what's weird about it, is because we can look at it now as an ensemble piece and it works well as an ensemble piece. I'm not sure James Whitmore got that memo though, because he's really pushing his stardom, and I read not just about the lifts in his shoes to try and compete with James Arness, but he was apparently doing sort of bits of business with his hands and stuff, and so that the camera would always be on him because he does get star billing. You know, if you look at the credits,
Yeah.
his name's the one that, but he's not. He's not really. And I think the problem. And I've not got a massive problem. I think it's a great film, and I love James. I love James Whitmore, but I think if anything, the problem is um, maybe they or he is not sure what to do with his character because his character's a bit fucking ridiculous because he goes from being like a low-level sort of sergeant. He's a beat cop
Yeah.
basically in a quiet little sleepy desert town, and then he's pulling a machine gun from from his boot, and then he's like an FBI G-man, and then he's Mr. Soldier Man, he's Action Man with his flamethrower. It's kind of what training academy did you go to?
I mean, it is strange, isn't it? Because in reality, the local cops would have just been sidelined immediately.
Yeah,
Wouldn't they?
yeah. Well, I know because he's sitting at the table with the fucking presidents.
Yeah.
Where does
But, I mean,
this happen?
I know, but yeah, I mean, yeah, he was very big, wasn't he, in the 40s and 50s?
Mm.
And I think that for the audiences, that must have been even more of a shock that he gets killed. You know, I'm
Yeah,
sure they were.
yeah.
The other thing I like about it is there. Okay, there's it's the 1950s, that cliched love story with James Arness and John Weldon, but it's not like lots of other films that would have had this love triangle
Yeah.
going on. But they don't complicate it with that. You know, they have to have the little romance thing, of course, but it's never like that he's vying for her hand, and there's a competition between the two young male leads or anything like that. But yeah, it is. I mean, when you think about it, it is strange, isn't it? He's involved right to the bitter end, and in reality, of course, he wouldn't be. You know.
No,
Um,
no.
but,
Also, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I don't know. This is complete speculation. Maybe they considered the love triangle, but I maybe they just threw it out because who's going to believe that anybody would go for James Whitmore over James Arness? I'm not. I don't know.
well, yeah, indeed. I mean, I've always thought it's curious because it was such a huge hit for Warner Brothers that there was never a sequel.
Mm. Well,
You know,
yeah, it's odd, isn't it? I'm kind of glad they didn't,
yeah,
but
me too.
it's yeah, it seems odd. Yeah, considering that something like they got 3 films out of the Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Mm,
I like those sequels, but by the last one,
yeah,
they were clearly running out of ideas. So but
yeah,
yeah, it's odd that this they didn't revisit this because I think, like you said, I think it's about the 50th biggest grossing film of the year, but I'm sure it was Warner Brothers' actual biggest film of that
it
year.
was huge for them. Yeah, yeah. It's and like we said previously, it opened the floodgates, didn't it? Because then Universal saw how well it did, and they made Tarantula, which is another great movie. With a desert setting as well. And then every type of creature you could imagine was suddenly getting magnified by atomic explosions. Um, but very few, I mean, in the decades since, very, very few films with giant ants in them. Lots of films about giant spiders, but ants, regular sized ants, we see a lot in movies, don't we? But
Mhm.
giant ones, I watched a film when I was over in Germany with Ruth. We watched this film called what was it? It was something desert. I can't remember. It was about giant ants, but it was awful. It was like an amateur. But they kind of paid homage to them, which I thought was quite cute. But the film's actually it was awful. The ants looked much worse than the ones in them. But I can't really think of any other movies that had giant ants, really, other than them.
The thing is, I don't anymore. I used to have an allotment a few years ago because that's the kind
Right.
of thing you do when you get into your 40s and 50s. You get an allotment. And I gave
Yeah.
it up after about a year because it seemed fucking hard. But I mean, having had an allotment, I was getting attacked regularly by red ants. They're
Oh.
little fuckers, they are. So I don't think you need ants don't have to be giant to be terrifying. Even if ants,
No.
if they were blasted with radiation or whatever and just became sort of 2 inches big rather than sort of they'd take over. I'm sure they were given a number of
Oh,
weeks, they would take over.
well, apart from the other ant film that I absolutely love, even though it's awful Hollywood romance drama thing, is The Naked Jungle with
Oh
Charlton
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Heston. And just worth watching for those final scenes where they are like millions of ants are on the move and start eating everything in their path. It's brilliant, you know. Um, but yeah, it's like, well, getting back to what you were saying. I mean, the cast is just uniform. I don't think there's a bad performance in that cast at all. You know.
And I think maybe the reason that they are relatively, I say relatively unknown, the I mean, as soon as this film's made and it's out there, it's big business, and lots of other studios start jumping on the bandwagon. But
Mm.
on paper at that time, I don't know if they approached bigger actors, but I'm pretty sure they would have said, "No, I'm not doing this. It's about
Yeah.
giant ants. What are you talking about?"
Well,
um,
yeah. Um, I what was very nice though is back in the 90s when I lived in Nottingham and I worked in the city
it's where
centre.
I've lived. I'm Nottingham.
I
So
know, yeah,
where
yeah.
whereabouts in Nottingham did you live?
At Forest Fields.
I lived in Forest Fields for 20 years. So I live in
Ah,
Sherwood now. I've gone up in the world, but I lived in
oh
Forest
wow,
Fields for
gosh,
for
yeah.
20 years. Yeah, yeah.
I used to work for a printers down in the city centre, and once a week on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, after I finished work at 5, I would just go to the cinema because it was always empty. There was never anybody in there to see whatever film was on that week. And I remember one week going, and it was The Relic,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I was like, "Wow, it's James Whitmore!" Like,
Yeah.
just suddenly pops up in another giant monster movie.
Was he playing the title role? Because he would have been by that time, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he was getting on a bit. I don't know. That might well have been his last movie. I don't know. I know he was in the wheelchair the whole film, but yeah, it's but yeah, with the whole remake thing, I mean, I'd like to see a reinterpretation, see what they could do with it. It could be either really awful or really great, But you know what? If they were to do it, like I always make this point because I do get a bit fed up whenever some remake is announced. Okay, I get it. I understand. Like, why keep remaking things? Make something new. But then again, I just think that I don't understand all the hate remakes get because the original's still there. It's not like it's
Yeah, you can't.
disappeared. You
Yeah,
know. Yeah, some remakes, some reimaginings are quite good. Others are just awful. But it's
but
yeah.
I'm not. I don't. I mentioned this before, but I don't buy into this thing of there's no decent horror films anymore. I just
No.
I really take that to task. Some of the best horror films ever made have been made this century, this decade. Some
Yeah,
incredible films.
absolutely. Great films. Yeah, I was watching. I was the other night in my hotel room. I was a bit bored, so I was flicking through Netflix, and I watched this film. I'd never even heard of it. It's a Spanish film called Valley of the Dead.
All
It's
right, yeah.
brilliant. It's about zombies, but set during the Spanish Civil War, and there's Nazis in there, and it's amazing. Like and never got a cinema release or anything. Most people probably have never heard of it. So yeah, so many good films. And the problem is, I read something yesterday. Everyone's now posting about Amicus.
Yeah, yeah,
They're
yeah,
doing
yeah, yeah.
Amicus, but it's going to be exactly the same as when Hammer were relaunched. Everyone will be like, well, this isn't like the Hammer that used to be. Well, of course it's not,
Of
because
course
it's
it
not
is.
1950, 1960, you know. I mean, it's,
I saw that same link as well, and you know, so I checked the comments straight away, and like within 3 comments, it's this is awful. This is it's like, for fuck's sake, can you just let them make a film before you jump on it and decide it's the worst thing ever?
yeah, it annoys me. So, yeah, so if they do a remake, I mean, I think I've heard in the last few months that talking about a them remake, but whether, you know, you hear all this talk, whether it actually comes off or not, but it could be spectacular, and it takes nothing away from the original.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I would have liked to. I mean, maybe not now, but I think back in his kind of heyday, I think Tim Burton could have done something really interesting with it.
Yeah,
Uh, you know, possibly Peter Jackson could have done something as well. I don't know. I didn't escape, and I think you know some of the best, well, some of my favorite films are remakes. You know, The Fly is brilliant. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the '78 version is incredible as
yeah,
well. The Thing, you know, all of these kind of things are just brilliant. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
you
Yeah.
know, at the Blob, I like the '80s version of the Blob. I think that's terrific. You
Oh, it's
know.
brilliant, isn't it? It's a lot of fun. Yeah, yeah. It's so who knows? We might see giant ants on the screen yet again with a bit of luck.
Okay. Well, so you know, what do you think is the kind of legacy of this film, and you know, what has it influenced, and how did it change cinema?
Well, I think in the immediate aftermath, of course, it just started that whole deluge of giant animal movies, which kind of predominated the cinemas in the 1950s, even to 60s, even to the 70s. Although by the 70s, it was getting ridiculous when you have like giant rabbits in a nice lead. Um, even giant rabbits
That's
don't look very
brilliant. I love
threatening.
that.
So, yeah. So, but also, I think it's, you know, I think in a way it wasn't just about influencing studios to do giant creatures, but these kind of nature goes wild stuff that became very popular in the 70s,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
which were just normal sized animals, but becoming a threat, you know, bees, ants, spiders, what have you. And certainly, I mean, you can see, like you mentioned, Joe Dante, I mean, and Martinet is the most obvious example of that. And I love how on the Blu-ray disc that Arrow released, they have the actual Mant
The Mant
movie,
film. Yeah, yeah.
which you kind of wished he'd made it as an actual film.
Because
It looks like a lot of fun.
they made that. I think that was the first thing they made. They
Right,
filmed those
right.
sections first, and then they did the rest of the film.
But yeah, I mean, I think I had a long-term influence, and you know, because even today, you know, films about animals gone crazy or monsters are still hugely popular with audiences. And but I think I don't know. I mean, it's different, of course, because you know we can't put ourselves in the mindset of someone audience member in the 50s, where the threat of nuclear annihilation was a very real thing. I mean, people were genuinely terrified the world was going to end, and so I think these films had a real resonance that they don't have now. I mean, the world could end, you know, who knows? But it's not. It's not. Do you know what I mean? It's not like there all the time that nuclear war could start at any moment. And I think it also kind of influenced, in a weird way, more mainstream Hollywood started to look at the effects of atomic bombs and atomic war and the end of the world, and made a lot, you know, made very very serious movies about it. Not with no monsters whatsoever.
Yeah.
Um, and you know that in the 50s and 60s again, that was a huge thing about the world ending, and you know, films like On the Beach and what's the one with Henry Fonda's the president, where basically he has to order the bombing of New York at the end. I can't remember what it's called for the life
Fail
of me.
safe.
Failsafe, that's the one. Thank you. Yeah, and all those kind of films. I think in a way, not in a huge way, but I think indirectly, we're probably a little bit influenced by films like them that take that concept of annihilation by nuclear war, but make it into a fun film with monsters. Um, because they're also getting a message across, when Edmund Gwen is talking about opening a door and who knows what's going to happen. He's talking about, the effects of nuclear radiation and fallout and very serious, depressing issues. But they're tackling it in a fun way, because they have giant ants in there. Whereas mainstream Hollywood is doing it in a much more serious way. So I think there's definitely an interconnection there. I mean, I think giants. I mean, we don't really get a lot of. I mean, apart from the reimagined Godzilla films, which that's to do with radiation as well, of course. And we don't get a lot of mutant giant monster stuff at the moment, do we?
No, I mean, I guess we've just had the Meg 2, but that's more supposedly about evolution and sort of all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff as well. But
yeah.
yeah, right. I don't know. Whether it's just people don't buy it, but I don't know. Like you say, like Godzilla, that franchise continues to sell well and be good. So, well, not necessarily good, but popular.
Yeah.
But yeah,
So,
I would like to see a return. There's things we don't see enough now. I'm sounding like an old fart now, but yeah, it's giant insects on screen and quicksand. What happened to quicksand?
yeah, it isn't there anymore. It's very
It's just
strange, isn't
gone.
it?
Yeah, quicksand's
All
no
dried
longer a
up.
threat. I was under mortal fear when I was a kid that I thought I was going to stumble into some quicksand.
Well, yeah, indeed. Yeah. Uh,
Um, Eric, any other thoughts to share on them before we finish up?
I think if anyone's not seen it, I mean, that's a great gateway into the whole giant monster. Uh, and for me, it'll always be the best. I mean, it was the first, and it's the best. And I think a very good companion piece to Godzilla, the Japanese Gojira
Yeah,
from the same year, and they're both tackling the effects of radiation in a different way. One is a lot of fun. Well, they're both a lot of fun, but as we mentioned earlier, Godzilla is actually a very depressing, brutal film. But I think that would make a great double bill. But I'm envious of someone who's not seen them to see it for the first time. We probably spoiled it a lot now, but I'm guessing anyone who comes to them, if you buy the DVD or the Blu-ray, it's got a giant ant on the front, so it's not.
yeah,
Whereas when I
yeah.
saw it, I had no idea. It's just the word "them" in the newspaper, and I knew nothing about the movie at all. So it was a revelation to me, and it stayed with me all this time, and that's why I'll just endlessly rewatch that movie, and I'd recommend it to anyone, definitely.
Yeah, if you are an adult and you've never seen it, I would still recommend it. You're going to get a kick out of it, but you know, the best possible time to see them for the first time is when you're 5 or 6 years old, I think. Uh,
Definitely, yes, yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
do you want to give us a quick plug of We Belong Dead?
Yeah, thank you. Well, so from 2 issues ago, we decided to sell our soul to the devil and go the Amazon route. Mainly because just the cost of printing and inks is just getting so ridiculously high. It was crippling us. It's not a professional publication. It's a hobby. We all do it for the love of it. And I was getting to a situation where I was actually losing money. So I didn't want to carry on like that. So we do. So it's now available on Amazon, and the big advantage there is that if you're outside the UK, you don't have those huge shipping costs because you just order it from your local Amazon, whether you're in Germany or France or US or Japan or wherever. But what's also been good is we've managed to put all the out of stock, all the sold out issues, are now up available to buy on Amazon as well. All the back issues and the specials, and we started to slowly put some of the books, make them available, like the 70s Monster Memory and the Peter Cushing book. So basically, if you just go onto your Amazon, whichever country you're in, and just type in "We Belong Dead," it should show all the stuff that's available. So we're going very strong, and I say I've just sent issue 37 over to the designer, so that should be out in a week or so, hopefully. And we've got lots of plans for next year. We're doing. Daryl's going to produce a Dracula special, looking at not the obvious contenders, but the more weird and out there interpretations of Dracula. And we're going to
should get Kim Newman on board for that.
We're going to do an interview with Kim.
Ah,
yes.
right, okay, yeah.
So,
See, for those that aren't aware, Kim Newman does this. Obviously, he's a brilliant sort of film critic and writer, but he also does this thing on Facebook where he does Your Daily Dracula, and he drags up some really obscure stuff. It's great.
Really obscure, yes. And the other thing, Daryl's proposed, and we're going to do a special, which is tentatively called From Hugo to Hammer, and it looks at that period of British horror films, because everyone does Hammer and Amicus and all that, but that period from Dead of Night, hence the Hugo because of the dummy, up until the Quatermass Experiment, because there's some very good films in that period that are never really written about. And the one I'm very excited about, which is actually now is going to be a double issue, so we're going to release 2 issues on the same day, is Japanese horror. And myself and Daryl sat down and compiled a list. And again, this comes back to the Dennis Gifford influence. Things like The Living Skeleton and the Silver-Haired Witch, and these weird, bizarre titles you never thought you'd see. And now you can get an Arrow release with lots of extras. But when we made the list, we realized there was just far too much to fit in a 100-page issue. So we're going to do 2. They'll both come out on the same day, and one will be the kaiju, so Godzilla and all that kind of stuff, and the other will be like the more supernatural ghost ones. So I'm really excited about that one. And then book-wise, we have just putting the finishing touches to Euro horror, and we're going to have the lovely Graham Humphreys is doing the cover for that. So that should be going for design in the next month or so.
Well, Graham was my guest on episode 2.
He was. I listened to his thing. Yes. He's always entertaining, very entertaining. And then the next book after that is going to be called. So we did a book a few years ago called Unsung Horrors.
That's right.
And it was very successful. So we did Son of Unsung Horrors. So this one, unimaginably, is going to be titled Unsung Horrors Has Risen from the Grave. But the difference here is we're going to take it right up into the 2000s as well, rather than have that 79 cut-off point that we did. And then we have Masters of Terror is also waiting. And that's the people on both sides of the camera involved in the history of horror movies. So, yeah, things are looking good. And if people want to keep informed, we have a website, which is just webelongdead.co.uk. And that has all our up-to-date information on there. And plus we have a page where people do, reviews and articles and stuff like that, which we just haven't been able to fit into the magazine. So, yeah.
Great. Talking about social media, in terms of T for Terror, you can check us out on Facebook and Twitter, on Instagram, and you can listen to us wherever you listen to your podcasts. But if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or whatever, then please, please, please give us a review, because it helps us out no end. It just remains for me to say thank you to my brilliant guest this week, Eric McNaughton. Cheers, Eric.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure talking about giant ants.
So remember to call round next time and make yourself at home. You're probably dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.